the LIFTE project, as Raggy has already mentioned, has been running since 2020, and it is LIFTE is looking in from the edge, and the project was a DFG AHRC funded project that was aimed to bring together scholars working in Germany and the UK. And so we came together to look at the impact of international commercialisation on Northwest Europe's peripheral communities, production, commerce and consumption in Orkney and Shetland. So we're really looking at trade and the impact of trade in the Northern Isles in the early modern period, but it's turned out over the course of the project to really be the kind of long 17th century. So in terms of the project team, Raggy's already mentioned that there's quite a lot of us. Most of us are listed here, but not all the volunteers. And you'll see why when I come to mention them in a moment. But we were looking at trade under three main themes. So we were looking at mechanisms of trade, the commodities, both those products that were being imported and exported from Orkney and Shetland, and then the people behind trade. And in order to do that, we were coming at it from slightly different places, both within Orkney and Shetland. So the project team consisted of Natasha Meller, who's at the University of Tübingen, along with two of her students, Philip Grassel and Bart Holterman, who'd all been working on the Hansa merchants and Hanseatic trade, particularly in Shetland and in Iceland and other parts of the North Atlantic. And so they wanted to continue with that research and to think more about Shetland. And then the UK side of the team, which is ourselves here at the UHI, along with Mark Gardner from Lincoln. Most of the Orkney-based team were thinking about what was happening in Orkney at the time, and that's something that hadn't been covered before. And one of the questions to answer is, why were there lots of Hanseatic mercantile activities taking place in Shetland and none in Orkney? And nobody had really looked into that. So whereas the Shetland part of the project was coming in on quite a lot of research that had been done and augmenting that and developing it, for Orkney we had very little knowledge at the start of the project, other than kind of the published sources, which basically said Orkney didn't trade with the Hanseatic merchants, and that was about it. So we're coming at different platforms to kind of understand and think about these topics. We started in 2020, and if you might remember, 2020 was an eventful year or a non-eventful year. And so we had to think about ways to begin the project based at home and working from home primarily at that point. And so as part of the Archaeology Institute, we really like to involve community involvement and offer volunteer experiences as part of our projects. And we had planned to set up some archive workshops, bringing people into the Orkney archive, showing them the archives, doing some paleography, cartography, etc. with them. And so Anne Mitchell and I, and Anne was one of the researchers in the project, put our heads together and thought, how can we do something online kind of equivalent to this? So we set up a historical research volunteer programme, which ran for 8 weeks during lockdown. And we thought, well, we would expect to get maybe 30 or so people to come to our workshops. So we'll think about the same, and we'll ask people to read documents online and teach them how to do deep reading and look for information about trading. And for those people that were based in Orkney, there would be an opportunity if they wanted to go to the library where access allowed. And so we put out the call, and within 4 days we had over 150 people sign up, which was incredible, from all over the world. And Anne and I looked at each other and went, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? So you can see here some of the statistics of it here. We had 13 time zones to work in. People were offering anything from 1 to 20 hours a week. This is because lots of furloughed professionals decided to sign up for the opportunity. And so we ended up with archivists, archaeologists, historians, students, all different people from all over the world wanting to do a bit of lifting. And it's changed the shape of the project because of that. So you can see we have these little groups that we set up People were looking at all sources that were available online that they could look at, and Anne set up a paleography group. There was a number of people who were interested in or had already done some paleography. So she was able to get scans of documents that she had been identifying in the archives as being relevant to the project. They were sent out and everyone transcribed them together. And you can see from up there, we have over 155 archive documents were transcribed and documented. We would not have been able to do that if we hadn't set up this project. But we got a huge amount of data, and it's that data that I'm going to be using today in the work that I'm going to show you. So that's why I wanted to explain to you what was involved in it. So as well as the historical volunteer work, which, as I say, focused on published sources. So that's the historical accounts, but also tours, also looking at Canmore as was, now Trove, and mapping sources as well. Once we were able to go out and about again, we started to go out and do the things that we had been planning to do. And that involved standing building survey. And Mark Gardner was responsible for that, along with Julie Gibson. And they went out and surveyed two storehouses that we know date to the 17th century, one in Bury and one in Ham. And also we did some coastal survey around Deer Sound, which we know had two ports in it from a historical document. So we went out to see if we could find any evidence of those ports in the landscape. And as well as that, we had underwater survey taking part that Philip Grassel led on as part of the survey, also in Deer Sound, looking to see if there was anything evident underwater. And then I'll hand over to Jane.
Yeah, I'll just talk about some of our other activities. So excavation, of course, is a pretty important one. We have been digging at scale on Rousay for 10 seasons now. So this was an ongoing excavation, which is of the right time period. Well, it also includes some Viking medieval, but we weren't digging those bits. So it's immediately relevant to the LIFTE project. And you can see here some of the complex stratigraphy that we've got with a variety of end-on-end buildings, as well as primary buildings. In the last couple of years, we've been excavating a very big storehouse, which has a very exciting two-story element and a staircase, which was really fun to dig. And there's pictures there of some of the variety of finds. And one of the reasons for doing this is the animal bone evidence. And I'm a zoo archaeologist. I'm there for the middens and the fish bones and those rubbish dumps. We also had tie-ins with other projects that are using biomolecular methods. Okay, someone has asked, is there a presentation associated with the talk? Yes, there is. So we can see the presentation. Other people online. Logan, what's the chat saying? Are people able to see the presentation? Okay, other people saying you have to click. Yeah, we got some thumbs up. Okay, Sam needs to click something, it sounds like. Can anyone advise on what we have to click? In the top right. I'm just going to open the chat on here and just see what we got here. Okay, in the top right, you got to click something apparently.
It looks like it is presenting from our end.
Yes.
I think you're good.
Okay, I think we're good. I'm going to keep going then. So we were talking about excavations. We wanted to find stuff. Thank you, Jane. And so we have our ongoing excavations at Scale Farm. We're going to be back there next July. We take volunteers if anyone is interested in the excavations of the last 1,000 years. Scale goes through a variety of status changes during its occupation. There's lots there for everyone. We also did a couple of excavations in Shetland. One of those was a known site of a Hanseatic merchant where we were hoping to find lots of nice evidence. And in the event, the soil was rather too acidic. For bone preservation, at least. Very nice plastic unicorn came out of there. But anyway, in the middle there shows some of our excavations in the back gardens of the historic core of Lerwick, and that was very successful. Lots and lots of animal bone and pottery and other finds coming out of those. Just small test pits, but very, very rich indeed. Okay, hang on. What do I need to do to advance? There we go. Here's some more of our finds. The pottery is very important. A lot of this comes in from the continent and is very diagnostic for helping us date our our archaeology, the other aspects of it. And here is just some examples of that. So we held a pottery specialist meeting and got a number of people here to come and talk through what we'd find and then basically tell us the dates. On the other side there, you can see some of the amazing coins that have come predominantly from Shetland's archaeology. Orkney has produced very, very few coins in comparison, but there's 139 of relevant date from Shetland, and that is indicative of people coming in and trading. You can see there, a lot of them are Dutch, but there's also Danish, the odd Norwegian, German, French, etc. Okay, just let that comment, maybe someone else can respond to that comment there. So yes, a number of artifacts that were helpful in determining dates, but also where people were coming from and trade networks. And then the bones. So this is what I'm in this for, and also my colleague Ingrid Mainland, who's here with us, and then Julia Cussans, who is flying back to Orkney today and can't be with us. So we were really interested in the mammal, the bird bone, the fish. That's my involvement. Also the marine shell I was looking at. And the fish bone was particularly successful. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. We were also interested in the plants. And in the end, the plant story is not terribly exciting, but there were some fig seeds from Kirkwall, not from our own excavations. But so the plants have been a little bit overlooked, both in the past and in our own projects. But, however, in the documentary evidence, there is a lot on grains. They're incredibly important to the economy. Okay, and we held a series of exhibitions. We had one in the Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, and then Stromness Museum and Shetland Museum. We were working with specialists in each of those areas, and that includes Siobhan Cook-Miller, based here in Orkney. Some aspects of the exhibits traveled that ended up being quite complex, and in the end, not as much could travel as we'd hoped. But you can see here some examples. This is in the first picture here on the left is in the Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, where we all went to visit and had a lovely time. And this is actually sort of a giant jigsaw puzzle of our excavations at scale on the floor of it, which was really fun, lifting the flaps and having a look. So this is some of the best artifacts from a variety of excavations, including other ones of contemporary date, but not ones we necessarily had dug up ourselves due to the complexities of moving material around post-Brexit. Anyway, very successful trio of exhibitions. And there is a booklet that we all pulled together, which is available to download. There'll be a link at the end. As a nice little short booklet, not too much text, nice pictures in it. Okay, now Sarah Jane is going to talk about the presentation. So we each have a short bit where we're talking about our own work, and we presented this at the Ruralia conference 2 years. 2023, okay, which has subsequently been published, and these came out in September of 25. And those publications are also linked at the very end. Okay, over to you, Sarah Jane.
Okay, thank you. So I was looking at trying to better understand the trading landscape in Orkney. So this is all to do with the Orkney side of things. And before I begin on that, just want to remind us of where Orkney sits within the world, hence the map here, and particularly nice because Orkney is lovely and big in this world map, but it's very relevant for the networks that you're going to see in the following slides. The material that I'm drawing on, as I say, I'm indebted to all the volunteers, to Anne Mitchell's work and to Jocelyn Rendell's work, and it's pulling all that together along with some of my own work that's produced the information that you're going to see. Before I begin, I just want to jump back a little bit to make sure that you all know about Kirkwall. So Kirkwall's the main town in Orkney, and it was a town in the medieval period. So it's our oldest town, and we know that from the 12th century there was trading happening in Kirkwall, and then that develops through time. It is then designated as a royal borough very soon after Orkney and Shetland become part of Scotland. But prior to that, it seems very, very likely, given the little evidence we have, but it points to Kirkwall having had similar trading rights and privileges under the Danish crown. So it was a recognised trading town from the Middle Ages. We know from Orkney and Gassaga and other places, other sources, that it's not the only trading place in Orkney. We've also got Pirrawall and Westray as another trading place. And the Orkney and Gassaga tells us about, there's a story of Svein Asleferson, and he disguises himself as a trader and gets access to one of the estates in Orkney, and then he's murdered and kidnapped. But the fact that as a trader he's allowed access to an estate in the Middle Ages is quite pertinent, because it's really important moving forward into the early modern period, or certainly that's what the sources we've been looking at have been telling us. Jen will talk to us about the commodities, but just so that you kind of have a knowledge of them, Orkney is exporting mixed agricultural, grain and animal products alongside feathers and oil and various other bits and pieces, but it's all agricultural materials, so it's natural that the people that own the land should have a big part to play in trade, and so that connections come together. But how many merchants are there? Where are they based? Where are they trading? And these are things that we didn't know at the start of the project. This is the kind of material that we've been working with primarily, and this is the material that Anne uncovered in the archives. Whereas for Shetland, as I've mentioned, there's already quite a lot of good knowledge because the archives in Shetland have been published, material looked through by John Ballantyne, who's a specialist in this time period. Orkney hasn't had that. And so these documents that Anne found and sifted through were all from one collection called the Trail Denizen Collection. And these date from, most of the ones we're looking at, in the 1600s, and have never been published before and rarely looked at. So it's a new source, if you can count a 17th century archive collection as a new source. But this is the material that we're working on, and it's been augmented with other sources, kind of the normal historical sources you might imagine. So how do we use this data? You can see here, this is one of the examples. So we've got a list of a trip to Bergen, and you can see what they're paying out in terms of expenses for that trip. The sources are incomplete, there's fragments. So Anne started to notice that this person called Peter Winchester kept popping up in the records, and so decided that in order to get a glimpse of what's going on in Orkney, we'd focus in on this particular merchant. So we looked at Peter Winchester in particular to try and understand Orkney merchants through his archive, because it was so very rich. And what you're seeing here is the mapping of the movement of Peter. And so what we've been able to do is, over on the far side there, you can see the blue dots are where we know that Peter's in a trading voyage. So we've used the documents and mapped them out. You can also see we've mapped where he drowns, he dies off Fraserburgh in his ship. His estate is the little brown mark here. And where he lived, because we know he lived both in the countryside in Tankernas, Tankernas, and also he lived in Kirkwall, and many of these merchants did that. They had a sort of estate country house and a house in the town. So by being able to map this, we can really see the extent to which the merchants are moving around. And Peter is quite exceptional in what he does. He is employed by some of the families in Orkney to go and trade the surplus grain that is being produced in Orkney, or the rents, and he goes and trades them, makes a profit and brings material back in, and we get lists of those materials that are coming in. And this map shows him going as far south as La Rochelle, where we know he was getting salt. But in the years since 2023, Anne's found how many more? Another 80 or so documents relating to Peter Winchester in another part of the archive, in another collection, which haven't yet been transcribed. And even before that, there was one other document that has him in Spain. So this map is going to have to get bigger, I think, as we work, hopefully in the future, on looking more into this merchant. So that was Peter on his own. Now, here you can see all of the Orkney merchants that we found in the documents. So anyone that's mentioned as being a merchant in Orkney is mapped here. And some of them you'll find that they're both a merchant in Orkney and then they're found somewhere else. So these are the places that they're trading to or with, where the dots take you. And you can see we've got Peter in there because La Rochelle's down at the bottom as well. And then we also have a range of merchants we're finding. So we have some that are just a merchant in one place. And I've put some of the examples up here for you. Then we get merchants who are working out of two places. So we have John Nisbet, who's of Swanee, which is in Bursey, and he's listed as a merchant in Bursey. He's also listed as a merchant burgess in Kirkwall. So we're finding him in both places. William Sutherland is a Kirkwall merchant who's trading in Elgin, and there's a big dispute over a barrel of Spanish salt. So he ends up in the records because of that. And then we have Hugh Sinclair, who's a merchant in Kirkwall and at Scockness in Rousey, which seems an unusual place to be a merchant, but it's just really interesting. And we do have a storehouse in Rousey that we'll see later. And then we also get Orkney merchants who move elsewhere, and lots of them move to Norway. And so we have a few examples here where we've got Arcadians who move and live their lives in Bergen and in Trondheim and form part of that mercantile communities there. And many of these have brothers or relations who are also merchants in Orkney. So it's very much part of a family network. I was also interested in looking at how these merchants are trading. So because we've got Kirkwall as a royal borough, we would expect most of the trade to be centred there. And the sources on the far side of the table will show you that this is indeed the case. And of the merchants that we had at that point that I made the table, of the 329 merchants in Orkney, 240 of them are based in Kirkwall. So you can see nearly all of the activities based there. But then it is also dispersed throughout the islands, perhaps more so than you might have expected, given that Kirkwall really should have been where all the trading was taking place. I also kind of foolishly or naively thought I'd be able to find lots of information about early modern markets, and I couldn't. So the circles on this are the only examples of markets and fairs that I was able to date to the early modern period. There's lots of evidence of ones that are a bit later, but trying to get them dating to that earlier period is more challenging. So that's why the circles here are not all over. I have no doubt there were more local markets happening, but we just don't have the surviving historical evidence for them. And Eddie is quite an interesting example because we have two fairs that take place in Eddie, and that's because it was also a borough for a short time. So we have the document for Eddie, and it was St Bride's and St Peter's. But the main fairs and markets were all taking place in Kirkwall, as we would expect. It's not doing the click thing. But never mind, it's okay. So the second merchant then that we looked at to contrast with Peter Winchester is someone called David Trail, and he's part of the wider Trail family who were merchants in Orkney just towards the end of our period and into the early 1700s. And some of the later papers of the Trails have been published previously by Hugh Marwick, and the archival documents that Anne was working on were earlier papers from the same collection. So all of our work is from the same collection. And here we can see David Trail's movements in the same way as I charted Peter Winchester's. This time you can see there's more movement within Orkney. He's much more mobile within Orkney, travelling around. And the big circles are the estates where he had land. So he is moving around his estates. He's gathering rents, grain. He's gathering it all up from his tenants, and then he's going away from Orkney, as you can see on the far side, and he is selling that grain in other places, and he's buying back lots of different things, but including timber, iron, and then much more exotic goods as well. And so we can see this pattern where he actually moves around Orkney with his boat, collects the rent, and then goes off on a trip, and then comes back, and often fits in a trip in Edinburgh where he has family also working. The two smaller circles, Stromness and Pirawall are places where we know that there were little trading centres. So he's also going to those where he doesn't have land. So you can see this combination of how he's moving around Orkney. And as I said before, this is a bit like Svein Sleeperson going to an estate and getting in because he owns it or he's known there. So this idea of using your estates and the fact that you're in an archipelago, you have to travel by boat. And effectively, your boat becomes your shop. So what we're seeing is that there's not so many shops or booths because they're actually the boat, which is a really interesting thing to have kind of seen in these records. Having said there's not many shops or booths, there are a few. And again, I'm really restricting these to the sort of 16th and 17th century. And so we have some trading booths, and those with a square around them are from place name evidence. So most of them are from place name evidence, and we have some from sources as well. But that's the only booths that we have that date to our time period. So you can see there's not all that many. But again, think about a boat as a booth. And then we also looked for storehouses, again, as part of that mechanisms of trade. So where they're storing the grain is a sensible place for that transactions to take place. And these are the two that were surveyed at Ham and Bury on the two blue squares. And the yellow dots are where there are other storehouses that definitely date to the early modern period. And again, the problem with the archaeology here is that we have many storehouses that date to the 19th century, but it's very difficult to know if they predate that. So I've only used them when we know through sources that is the case. So there's likely more dots, but I've been conservative in mapping only those that were certain existed in the early modern period. So in summary, really, with this part, the use of those historical documents, and particularly the archival material and the transcriptions, have been able to show us, from knowing very little, that we had Orkney merchants trading in all these places, not surprisingly trading with Shetland and with Scotland, but more surprisingly the extent to which they're trading further afield. And not only that, but we're also seeing within this the mechanisms of trade where we've got storehouses, booths and boats as the means in which trade is taking place. In terms of the archaeological input to this, what I've shown you is nearly all from documentary sources. And part of that is because the archaeology is very difficult, as I've said. So we have an example here of a storehouse that we surveyed as part of our coastal survey, but we don't know the date of it. We can't say if it's definitely early modern. Its building as it is just now looks later than that. So, but there could have been something there before, as is the case with the Gurnall, which we know is of early modern origin, but has been very much changed through time. So again, it's just how we deal with the archaeology and what's left. And just a lovely map of Kirkwall, just to remind you of how different it is at that point of trade, and that we're really dealing with boats coming right up to your doorway. So the boat as the booth is really something that's worth considering. Oops, sorry. And that last one, will I go back? Yeah, and this was just as a kind of reminder that much of these trading networks that we're seeing and the mechanisms of trade that we're unpicking in the early modern period that begin earlier in the medieval period continue to today. So they're all part of that ongoing tradition. And we still have fairs and markets and annual occurrence when we show off our animals so that they get a good price at the mart the following week. And still a place for social activity, as were the fairs in the early modern period. So there we go. I'll hand over to Jen now.
Okay, thank you. Right, we'll return to some environmental archaeology here. So this is very much co-authored with Ingrid and with Julia as well. So let's talk a little bit about the produce from the Isles. There we go. So the questions I was asking what was the archaeological evidence that we had for food production and trade, and then how does this compare with the history? So we've already heard about the incredibly rich historical documentation that has been produced as part of this project. The transcriptions are invaluable. I've learned a bit of paleography as the project has continued, but I'm still in awe of the paleography skills that our volunteers and that, that Sarah Jane and Anne have. So I've been able to read their nice Word documents and search for keywords, which is very helpful. So we know that things like butter and grain and dried and salted fish are all really important products from the Isles. And so we're wondering about how these products move around. There's other animal products as well as fish and marine mammal oils, not something we'd find in the ground. So that's where the historical documents are really important. Okay. So we were basically at the beginning of the project, we were asking about how these orientations play out. We know a lot of fish is moving from Shetland to the continent, and we know that grain and butter is moving around as well, and going down into Scotland as well. But really, when we started, we were uncertain of the quantities and exactly what was moving where. And as a zoo archaeologist, I had a bunch of wider questions. So before we started this project, we had a really good idea what's happening in the Viking Age Late Norse. There's been an awful lot of work on the Viking Age up here, including my own PhD, looking at an awful lot of animal bones. And then that kind of comes to an end right when some interesting things happen, like the world gets rather cooler through the Little Ice Age. There's also the Black Death. And then the Northern Isles become really marginal when the New World fisheries open up. So how does all this play out in the ground and in the bone story? And also that important contrast once decent history starts to be introduced. So before we started the project, there was a real interest in the fish trade. There's some pictures of it still going on today from Arctic Norway. This is about using the cold, windy climates of the north to air dry fish and to export those to big urban centers like around the Mediterranean, where this still happens today, and what was once a very cheap source of protein has become, of course, a luxury product that's quite expensive. And we can tell that story very easily with the zoo archaeology, because we have really, really nice patterns of heads not generally moving, bodies going to the table, and then some bones from the back of the head generally going with the meat but not arriving at the table. Really nice zoo archaeological signatures. So we have the zoo archaeology, and then we have our sources. So I am told that image there is dating from 1674, is an agreement between Peter Winchester, who we've heard all about, to set up a salted herring industry in Rousay. Now, we don't think anything much happened. There's certainly no follow-up, which is quite frustrating, but there's a lot of information there. It's actually a time when there's a lot of herring industries popping up, copying what the Dutch do. So the Dutch are really successful at fishing for herring. They have basically early factory ships operating around Shetland, occasionally coming down to Orkney, but it's mainly the story of the Dutch herring fishery is around Shetland. And the Dutch get their act together early on. They bring together all of the specialists needed to barrel the herring on board. They have the right salt. They have everything they need. And lots of people, including Peter Winchester, going, oh, they're getting really rich on that herring. Why can't we do that? And the answer normally is because they haven't got the investment, and that might have been what failed here. Then we also have, I can read this one. This is 1715. So when it gets into the 1700s, I can just about read it. And that's another attempt at setting up an early herring fishery out of Stronsay. And if you know your history of Stronsay, they do become a major center for herring, but only in the late 1800s. So we have incredible primary documents telling a story about these copycat herring fisheries. And then we have some published books. I can read those. They've all been digitized. Keyword searches are great. So that's a really important one as well. That's about someone coming up from London in the early 1600s, going up to Shetland, going, oh, look at the Dutch. They're getting really rich. Let's do that. In the event, it was never fully copied, but they wrote it all down, which is really handy. So the mammal and bird story, we had about just over 2,000 bones from urban Lerwick, lots of sheep, goat and cattle. What is really surprising is it seems to be much more of a rural pattern. Urban Lerwick is not behaving like other urban areas. We also have rural scale farm, scale and Rousay, about 900 bones there. That does behave itself. It's behaving much like every other rural site, which is great. So we have a lot of neonatal cattle being killed. Why? About dairying. It's about having the humans accessing the milk, and they can turn that into butter and use that as an export product. Also lots of traction. So this is about using cattle as early tractors. Also lots of rabbits. Julia's got really excited by the rabbits. Normally rabbits, we kind of dismiss them because they dig down into the archaeology and we think, oh, bloody rabbits getting in the way. These rabbits had butchery marks and they were burnt, which means they were not doing that themselves. So there was actually a lot of rabbit processing, and it matches the historical documentation. Rabbit skins are really important. Also, they were eating them, but we know rabbits are not particularly nutritious, but they fill a gap when nothing else is there. With urban Lerwick, it is about provisioning ships that are coming into Lerwick. So Lerwick develops on the back of the herring industry. It's about provisioning ships. They come in for fresh water, for fresh meat. And so we know some of these urban sites are provisioning these ships. They also come in for buying knitted stockings and for prostitution. It happens in ports. With the fish bones, this is an incredibly rich story. I looked at over 20,000 fish bones from urban Lerwick and from Scale Farm, over 16,000. And that was just the context relevant to the LIFTE project. There's a lot more coming out of Scale Farm. And almost all of these were very small saithe. And there's an example here from pre-COVID at one of the farm museums. These are small silks, piltoks. They have a number of local names. They're a close relative of cod. When they grow up, they become coal fish as well for the bigger ones. They're gray fleshed versions of cod. Perfectly lovely and tasty, but they're gray, so they're not really commercially available. It just doesn't look as appealing. Very few herring, 1% or so or less. Which was very surprising indeed, because we know how important the herring industry is. We had some butchery marks, don't need to go into that too much right now. In terms of the grain, so important, they pop up in all the historical documents. It's about bare barley and oats. And the few samples we've looked at from our sites also show barley and oats. This is no surprise. Honestly, we haven't put the time and effort into analyzing a lot of samples. This story is not that exciting. But so another excavation in urban Kirkwall did produce some fig seeds. That's probably the most exciting part of the plant story. But when you get into the history, we have cinnamon coming in and oranges and tobacco as well, thinking of plants, including a really important early reference to pigtail tobacco, which has got the people interested in archives very excited. We also have an awful lot about the collection of the bare barley, malt as well, I hadn't mentioned, and oats and oatmeal. These are really important, coming from all over Orkney and Shetland, and people are paying their rents in these products as well as butter. So in terms of what we expected versus what we actually got, using cattle for dairy produce and traction, that's totally behaving itself. Using sheep for wool and some meat, absolutely, we expected that. Growing oats and bare barley, yep. Absolutely. And eating small and inshore saithe, yes, we totally expected that. But we expected the fish that are talked about in the documents to be appearing in the archaeological record, and they're just not there. So we're not getting the herring, and we're also not really getting much in the way of cod. Of the big salted or preserved cod is not there archaeologically. In other words, the herring and the big cod are too important as an export product. We see the same thing with salmon going on in the Highlands through a lot of the medieval and early modern. Salmon is so important that they almost never eat it, except when it's poached, and then they're probably not putting it in the normal middens, they're eating it secretly, and so we just don't get it archaeologically. And urban Lerwick, not behaving itself either. So yeah, the fish are just too valuable as an export product, so we're not seeing it. And this does match a little bit of sometimes hints of this in the early printed sources. This is a book that was written in 1633, which mentions about people selling fresh cod and ling to merchants who have their booths built in Shetland, and also talking about using the small fish saithe, eating them locally. They fill hunger gaps when there's nothing else. The livers of these are also really important, and this is about using small saithe and any other fish available really to make cod liver oil, and they use that for lighting purposes, and it's an export product. So we have all of these animal and plant products. We know that people are having to gather these up. These are bulky things that need to be stored in buildings. Where are they going? They're being stored. So people are paying their rents, big bulky rents. They're going into these big buildings and they're stored. It's butter in barrels. It's bare barley and malt, often loose. There's flesh as well. That's probably salted or preserved beef, or pork on occasion, and barrels of fish oil, all of which need to be well sealed. And we do have lots of accounts of leakage as well, and fish oil leaking is going to be horrible. So thinking about that surplus, and very briefly, I just wanted to mention about the inventories. Now, those of you who heard the talk that some of us gave 2 weeks ago. Julia gave a really brief summary, which included some of these maps. So I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly, but this is an amazing source of historical information relating to inventories taken at death, which someone else put it together in a book, so it's easily readable. And these inventories date from 1573 to 1615. There's almost 200 of them, and they give a snapshot of what someone owned at their death. And it includes a lot of livestock information on livestock ages, what was planted in the ground, what was stored in the barn, and any other nice things that they happen to have, and things like boats that they had. And each of these have locations, and then we have central places where they recorded all this information, and that includes scale where we're digging. That's the locations of all of them. We were able to do this because farm names have not changed very much in 500 years, which is really helpful. So we were able to work out which of these little farmsteads, these little townships, are paying their rent in different products. So which areas are making a lot of bare barley, that's the orange, which are paying their rents in oats, in the blue, in the green in the middle, and then the brown is the malt. And you can see this real geographical patterning. This has totally surprised us. There's a real pattern of bare being restricted to the outer isles and the sort of eastern side. Hoy is producing an awful lot of bare barley, bit of a surprise. And we were also able to do the same thing. Where's the butter coming from paying for rents? Well, we were able to see where all the farms were, but there's certainly very specific geographical patterning to where the butter is coming from for paying the rents. And on the other side there in the white, you can see where all the female cows are. So where all the females who are producing milk. So there's lots of areas where they definitely have cows, but they're not paying their rents in butter. And this is probably, these people at the individual farm level don't have any say as to what they're paying their rents in. This is probably about organizing Orkney in order to extract everything in the most efficient way possible by the lairds, by the sort of higher up. We were also able to look at where the oil, now this is primarily fish oil, occasionally seal oil, and it has really interestingly produced an important center down at the bottom on Hoy, where they're producing a lot of fish oil. That means there's a small fishing industry there. Totally unexpected, didn't see that in other historical sources. So we know if we're going to get any more funding to do this, we need to go there and we need to look for some middens. No one's looked. Who has the boats? That's in the pink there. You can see there's lots of people owning boats. Bit of a cluster down the South Ronaldsay there. And when we add on some extra information, we can see that South Ronaldsay has a bit of a fishing industry where they actually have some big boats. They've got fishing kit as well. And then someone has a great boat. In other words, that's a boat that can go longer distances, probably for shipping stuff. A couple of them there. So thinking about pulling all this stuff together, we know that there's a lot of bulky stuff that needs to be exported from Orkney to turn it into cash or to trade it for nice things like cinnamon. How are they going to do that? Well, we know that a lot of the stuff from Orkney is going down to Edinburgh, to Leith, I should say, but that's the port for Edinburgh. But getting it there in this time period is really challenging. There are lots of threats. There's piracy and there's privateering. And actually, some of our characters from Orkney engage in privateering, not taking products from Orkney, taking products from other ships, from other nations. I think, is it Peter Winchester? So he's a bit of a pirate on the side too. Yeah. So it's all part of the story. But so Orkney merchants need to get these bulky, low-value goods down to Leith. How do they do that? Well, there's trading convoys that are established. In other words, you get the ships together, you go in convoy, you have some support as well. And there is a sort of government-level support to help protect these, just as the Dutch herring industry has had from its beginning. That's one of the reasons for its success, is it has basically gunships with it. I'm probably using that term completely wrong. It has basically state-sponsored convoys to scare away the privateers. And from the early 18th century, we know that merchantmen from New England and the West Indies would actually gather here in Orkney and then travel down as a huge convoy going down to Leith. We have, so the process goes from probably very regional storehouses to the big ones that Sarah Jane's been talking about, and then going all the way down to Leith. And at Leith, they had a crane that dates from 1678 where they were able to winch stuff ashore there. So that's the sort of process of getting the stuff to the ultimate markets where a lot of this was consumed. Things like that butter, a lot of that is not actually butter for human consumption. We know some of it is going to oil the big guns at Edinburgh Castle, for example. So pulling all this together, we've been able to tell a story from the archaeology and augment it with the most amazing, rich historical documentation, which has been transcribed for the first time, and we're able to use it. So there's a really interesting story coming out there with the fish not being as expected, and a lot of fish being just so important for export. We're not finding it in the ground. We can reflect on that from other archaeological sites where maybe if you don't find what's expected, why might that be? And then we can really use that important historical information to track these dense products from the land and the sea, and think about where they're going to their ultimate producers. So I think this is also the key point here. There's so much more to do with historical records. We're really just getting into it. So there's a lot more publications to come as well from the LIFTE project. We are pulling together a monograph, which is almost there. It has been almost there for a while, and then we keep finding new sources and amazing things pop out in the archives, and we need to not read them, which is finished. But there's a lot of spin-off papers as well that we've been planning. There's all sorts of extra stuff that we want to do one day, and we're also talking about maybe finding some more funding to do other things in the future. And we have greatly enjoyed working with our German colleagues as well. Do you want to come back up, Sarah Jane, and we can stop sharing? Which button do I push I don't want to end the event. I just want to stop the share. Did I do this big here? How we are sharing. Where do we, where's the stop? I don't know, because I there we go. So presenting. There we go. Okay, a bit of a delay on it. There we go. So, questions? Oh, thank you. Okay. Right. So you guys are welcome to unmute yourselves and you can ask questions, I think.
Logan is also keeping an eye.
Thank you, Logan.
Any questions posted in the chat?
Okay. Okay.
Have we got any?
Ben? I can see Ben's hands up.
Oh, yeah. Can we turn the lights back on?
You just mentioned at the start discrepancy between research into this kind of stuff between shown and not being. Obviously, you know, are you now in a position where you can start to make that comparison and think a bit more about what if there are differences or what the differences might be?
Yes, I think that's the short answer. But yeah, I think we are. There's quite a few discrepancies, you know, between Orkney and Shetland, in terms of preservation. You know, in terms of the bone preservation between Orkney and Shetland is different, isn't it? She says, not being a zoo archaeologist. Also, the amount of coin evidence from Shetland is because they have a really active metal detecting group. So the reason that there's so many coins in Shetland isn't necessarily because there's lots more coins in Shetland, it's just they've been found in Shetland, whereas they've not been found in Orkney.
There's only one person who does.
Yeah, so that's different between Orkney and Shetland too. So even though we're looking and comparing the two island groups, it's difficult to do that because of those differences. But I felt quite strongly that we should be doing that because quite often they are looked at together, you know, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody else. As an Orcadian, I'm interested in Orkney, and you know, so I think about Orkney, and there's definitely connections that we've pulled out in the records where we're you know, seeing in terms of the historical records, we've got lots of activity between Orkney and Shetland, and it's to do with the collection of the rents. So much of this trade is all to do with not surplus, but it's rent. So you've got the landowners collecting the rent that everyone's having to pay, whether they have it or not, and they're collecting it from Orkney and Shetland. And then, as Jen was saying, you know, they get convoyed down to Leith by the people that have the great boats, and they all have shares in the boats, and then they have their list that they want that either comes from Leith or they go further afield, depending on where they're trading and where the markets are. But there's definitely been more similarities between Orkney and Shetland, and towards the end of the period, because the Hansa merchants in Shetland are dominating at the early point, and then towards the end of our period, 1712 it's the reason it's the end is because at that point the Hansa merchants aren't allowed to trade anymore in the same way, and before that you're seeing Shetland merchants starting to work on their own. And that's Brian Smith from the Shetland Archives has written a bit about that for our project that'll be in the monograph, and seeing the development of the Shetland merchants as the Hansa merchants decline.
So Paul has asked about research coming out of Shetland. I think we've just kind of answered that one fairly well. Yeah, there's a lot of historical documentation that was already digitized for Shetland, which is incredibly useful. So again, searching for keywords there is pretty handy. There's quite a story about the products that were coming in and out as well. So there's a question there about what goods are being exchanged.
There's a whole other paper on that, to be honest, because we just focused in on merchants for this particular paper. But partly what I'm doing, must stop getting distracted, is making lists of the goods that are coming in. And there are just so many different goods. And we're seeing, you know, this is when sugar starts to come in as well. And as you said, tobacco's coming in.
Cinnamon.
Lots of spices.
Ginger.
And also lots of dyeing products. So different, like, can you think of it? Madder, and lots of things that we don't know what they are, and we have to look them up because we're looking at these documents and the words are sometimes in Scots and sometimes in Dutch and sometimes in Norwegian and sometimes in Orcadian. So we're sitting there trying to figure out what these products are. Cork.
Paper or pepper.
Yeah, paper or pepper.
So in Orcadian, it's the same word in Orcadian, not with my.
Because the spelling of it is just.
Well, how they're carrying it and handling it.
You can tell the
difference. Pepper
difference.
or paper.
Yeah, and then lots and lots of wood coming in from Norway. So that trade that's been going on from the Middle Ages is continuing through, and it's really dominating. And I think one of the things that I didn't say that I probably should have at the start was that Orkney has this well, it doesn't have a surplus, but Orkney has lots of grain that it's selling. And Shetland doesn't have as much grain. So you've also got the trade between Orkney and Shetland, because Orkney gives grain or trades grain with Shetland, and in return they're getting some of the products that the Hansa merchants are bringing over. So you can see the trade with the Hansa merchants is taking place, but it's not directly with Orkney, it's indirectly through those merchants with their boats. And so we're going over to Norway, who also want grain, and we're buying back timber and iron products primarily, and we're targeting the markets that are taking place in and around Bergen and the coast to do that. And if they miss the market there, then they keep going till they find somewhere to sell the grain before it overheats and they lose the lot, because the grain's a really volatile product to be trying to ship around. You're making it's just, you know, you really think, why were they doing it, to be honest? You know, it's so difficult. Whereas Shetland doesn't, it's got different products to sell, and needs different things. So again, another difference between the two island groups.
Someone's mentioned salt, which is something that we could talk for ages about. So there is some salt production up here on Edie. Particularly, there's some salt pans made with the local peat, boiling up the seawater. But that's a very low quality of salt, which you can use for some things, and you can use it to salt meat from mammals. But if you want to be doing anything involving herring or other fish, you need the imported salt coming in from the Mediterranean or from France, those sorts of areas, or the mined rock salt from Germany. Otherwise, the herring won't. Basically, the outside's fine, the middle bit rots, which is going to be disgusting. So you need this important imported salt. So there's a whole bunch of documentation about that. There's also lots of import duties on bringing in foreign salt, and then there's ways around it. People are allowed to import it if it's for fish processing, duty free. So the economics of the whole time period is really interesting. It's taken us a while to get our heads around the economics of it. We also see the start of lines of credit being exchanged with lots of merchant families having one of their own in various ports on the continent, in Norway and in the Netherlands and Germany, where they're arranging basically credit systems, and you just see that starting to come in, and that really lets trade take off, though it's risky. Whole dynamic with Hansa merchants, that is indeed a whole nother lecture. There's a question here about records of shrines. Oh, and someone's Paul Sharman. Thank you, Paul. You've answered that one already. But shrines, yeah, interesting. It is 5 o'clock. Do we want to? When do you need to?
One or two more questions.
Yeah. Is there any more in the room? we've been focusing on our screen. Yes, Martin.
I didn't think she's 14.
No, we didn't either until we started. Yeah.
I mean, there's a massive slipway, a clearway that's been, you know, at the bay at Winnet, and there's huge nests and things. It made me think of all the erosion survey work that happened over in the late 90s and 2000s, Graham and Hazel. I just wondered, not that you need any more sources of evidence, but I just wondered if there was a nice way into the coastal archaeological resource that pertain to your period as well, especially if we can rank the scale of them and then sort of say, well, this one's a biggie.
Yeah.
A biggie.
Well,
St. Margaret's Hope, really important. It's such a
among
sheltered.
the volunteer work, we had a number of marine archaeologists that were amongst our lot, and they looked at aerial photography, and they looked through Canmore, some of the ones that were familiar with it, and they pulled out everything that looked like it could be something archaeological on the coasts of Orkney. So I have like thumbnail photographs that they've pulled out of lots and lots of potential that has also been matched with Graham and Hazel's surveys that were pulled out if there was anything that was considered to be relevant. But it's not been tied together. So it's all in this massive database of nearly 15,000 rows. So there's potential started with that could go into it. Plus we had someone who looked and pulled out every single geo place name out of the Ordnance Survey name books, just because we were interested in, you know, the potential for landing places, because there's so little infrastructure. Could we learn anything from the names? We haven't even been able to touch on that because we've had so much other things to look at. So yeah, there's a lot of things to think about, and we do know about the boats and the shares though of the boats, and nearly every great boat is at least 6 people own it, or 4 or 6 people, and we can get the historical information about that and how they keep handing their boat share over in payment of debt, and it moves around. It's quite complicated. So it's so lovely to see a map where there's just a dot and a great boat, as opposed to in my head where they're all divided up across. Yeah.
That's a very good book.
And lots of the tiny boats are really part owned as well. So if people have like a tiny bit of a rowing boat.
So you still see beaches on New Sut, Grimness, Eastside, Winnick, and down to. So it's, I didn't know you don't have these.
Yeah.
Well, there's some living in the shoreline there as well.
Oh.
Is that it then? Please give a big hand for Jen. Thanks to everyone who joined us online and in person. And our next seminar will be the last Friday of February, when our guest speaker is Neil Sharples.
Oh.
Yeah. See you again then.
Right. Do that one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sir. Oh. And then yeah. Jenny was.